Everyone, this is Rick and welcome to Astral Club. This is Lower Astral Wildlife. Before we get into it, I just want to mention Patreon. If you'd like to contribute to the work of Astral Club, you can do so by joining Patreon. And all you have to do is go down to the description section and click on the link. Next up, private lessons. If you'd like a lesson to learn how to astral project, be glad to work with you. I've worked with people now all over the world. It's always a lot of fun, and I always learn a little bit of something new. And we've had some good success stories, too. I've got some great letters from people in the form of emails, because no one writes letters anymore, Rick. So if you're interested in that, just go down to the description, and there is an email there. You can ask for more information. Okay, I've got some bad news that I just want to pass on to everyone. It looks like I am temporarily suspended from astral projecting. Apparently, my whole Jesus stunt was not appreciated. My angel came and he gave me the bad news. It's not going to be a long suspension. It's going to be a short one. Just a little bit of a bare bottom spanking. Apparently you're not allowed to try to interfere in major world events. I mean, I'm like, what the F ever, right? So I told him to convey my feelings to his superiors, and I did that in sign language so that everybody could understand. So for a little bit, it looks like I'm grounded, but I don't think it's going to be that long. Worst comes to worst, I can always beg and plead and do a little bit of lying and say, I won't ever do it again. Please, please let me fly. But in the meantime, let's do other things like talk about lower astral wildlife. Now, of course, I'm going to use my own experience and Astral Dynamics by Robert Bruce to discuss this topic. Now, when you typically astral project, you're usually projecting from the physical into the lower astral. So normally your first experience out of your body is going to be in the lower astral. And I've already told people, if you want to avoid the interesting characters that you can meet on the lower astral, that you should immediately think of pure love and launch yourself into the sky. Because as soon as you do that, you are raising your vibratory level, you are going into another astral subplane, and you are escaping the wildlife that exists. So if you're not interested in doing rescue work, and I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you're really experienced, but unless you're interested in doing that type of work, or you really like going through the naughty zoo, you go ahead and launch yourself into the sky and you're going to be fine. But let's say you're one of those people who likes watching the movie It all day long, well, then you might be interested in some of this information. Okay, now Bruce starts off with troublesome types of astral wildlife appear to exist in these lower astral subplanes. Basically, they've got their home plane and then they've got the lower astral plane. They're generally very close subplanes. They can't exist at a plane that is higher than their native plane. These can be likened, he says, to parallel shadows that these things can exist in. Now, this is all part of the astral plane, but you might look at it as Bruce says, it's kind of like the night side of the astral plane because you've got the darker things that exist here. For example, shadow men. And I've had an episode where I discussed shadow men in detail, so I'm not going to go into too much detail now. But they are creatures native to the lower astral. They do not have high intelligence, but they're extremely good predators, much like mosquitoes. Mosquitoes feed on blood, and these things feed on strong emotions like fear. So they're really good at engendering that type of fear. And many of the other creatures on the lower astral operate in very much the same way. These creatures tend to be loner types. You very rarely see them grouped together. Because if you've ever played the D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, you'll notice that the evil characters always end up stabbing each other in the back. So they just don't get together, which is probably a good thing. They typically exhibit a cold and almost insect-type nature. Higher feelings like love and compassion and mercy are totally alien to them. Now, Bruce says, and I agree, that this does not necessarily mean they are evil. Because if you're going to infer the word evil, you have to infer the word choice. And in order to have choice, you must have intelligence. A spider is not evil for trapping a beautiful butterfly in its web. A mosquito, as much as a pain as these things are, they're not evil. They are simply creatures with no intelligence that make their living the way they make their living. And they've done so for millions of years, long before humans were around. But they're not good, they're not evil, they just operate on instinct. So many of these creatures you can't classify as evil because, like shadow men, they're not intelligent. They can exist in many interesting and creative shapes. All of these things are just various illusions and changeable forms. Many times, the more intelligent of these creatures, which isn't saying much, but they do have some level of intelligence, they have a low level amount of telepathy. And if you haven't trained yourself to discipline your thoughts, they can tap into your surface thoughts and read your fears. And then they can manifest in forms that you find uniquely terrifying. They can become ugly, grinning monkeys, gargoyles, harpies. They can go to the typical horned demon look. Or if you don't like spiders, big spiders. Real horrors right out of Tolkien. However, keep in mind that unlike the physical, the size and appearance of an lower astral entity does not necessarily give you a good indication of its actual strength or intelligence. It could be small and weak, and it loves looking big and dangerous. You might have, you might have stronger or more intelligent entities that don't bother with much pretense and just use their original form. Because they just don't care. They know that they're strong and they know what they can do. So they don't even bother to put on any airs and try to look extra scary here. I recall one experience I had in the lower astral where I left my body, and I could tell I was in the lower astral, but I guess I was thinking about maybe doing some rescue work. And it was definitely in the lower astral. And I saw at first what looked like some kids playing in the street, but then they all turned around all together and looked at me with glowing eyes, and then they sprouted horns and giant fangs, and then they charged me. So, this was in the early days of my projections. So they read the fears of young Rick, and that's what they became. Now, I could have run back to my body, and I'd have been safe that way. Or I could have done what I did, which was think of love, because I'd learned that at this point, and then soar up into the air. And I was able then to just fly over them, and they couldn't do a darn thing. All they could do is just kind of shake their fists and gnash their teeth looking at me, because they were unable to ascend to that higher astral level. It's beyond their capabilities. Bruce goes on to say that by far the most common types of astral wildlife he calls elementals. He says that they're fairly weak, timid creatures, and their appearance is often a greatly exaggerated illusion. I've seen wind elementals that really make a big display of their strength, but at the end of the day, they're nothing but a little wisp of wind. Most negative entities do go out of their way to avoid confrontations. They usually don't even want to be seen. They're off doing whatever it is they're doing. And a lot of the times they won't even interfere with human projectors. First of all, we're kind of rare. And unless they've got some sort of business or they think they can have some fun, they're just going to leave you alone. Now, as I've said before in the past, the big thing here is if you're going to walk on the lower astral, okay, if you're going to walk through the hood, you have to look like you belong. You don't go through the bad area of town looking like a victim, which is why I've said that whenever I'm transversing the lower astral, I always clothe myself in a hooded black robe. It's basically the universal language of leave whatever that is alone. And that's the way I like it. But unfortunately, you can have some astral projectors out there who are newer, find themselves in the lower astral, and go around being timid or showing fear. That's the worst thing you can do on the lower astral, because now you're just inviting trouble. It's like walking through, the very, very naughty part of your town, counting your money. You're asking for trouble. So, there's a certain persona that you have to take on, and you have to banish your fear. If you have it, bury it deep down, because that is not something that you want to have displayed in any shape or form when you're going through this side of town. As I've said before, you cannot be seriously damaged in your astral body. However, if you run into some rare creatures and you show fear or timidity, you can lose energy because they can drain some energy from you because you're essentially giving it to them in the shape of your fear. Now, these are still relatively rare types of incidents because most of what you're going to see in the lower astral is going to mind its own business or isn't going to mess with you because you're going to look like you know what you're doing. You may even dress yourself in a black robe, and they're going to leave you the heck alone because they're all cowards at the core. But there are rare cases that you can run into something that can leech some energy off of you. So if you can't avoid showing fear, don't go to the lower astral. But if you want to explore it, then make sure you go properly prepared. Bruce goes on to say that being attacked in a very real way by these very few creatures that can actually harm you in any way is very rare in the extreme, and he likens it to being the average recreational swimmer in the ocean and being attacked. And you've got millions of people go into the ocean every summer, and how many of them are actually attacked by sharks? Heck, how many of them actually suffered jellyfish stings? It's a very, very small amount. So, it's important not to blow this whole thing up into some giant, this giant fear monster, because it just doesn't really exist in a way that should really make you afraid, because they are very rare. And then Bruce caps it off with something I couldn't agree more with. He says, to the best of his knowledge, if projectors mind their own business, stay calm, use common sense, and project away if you find yourself in a bad situation, you've got very little to worry about. He says out of all the thousands of projection-related case histories that he's been consulted on, he's only come across a very small handful of situations where there was really any troublesome astral wildlife involved, and I have to second him on this. I've had many thousands of projections, and even when I was a kid and didn't know a fraction of what I know today, I was just fine. I was just fine. Here I am today of relative sound mind and body. So, just a word to the wise, be aware of what exists in the lower astral. If you're not comfortable with exploring the lower astral, then don't. Use the method that I've previously explained to raise yourself into a higher level. But if you are someone who's experienced, wants to do rescue work, and knows that you can walk in the wild side without showing fear or other weakness, then go for it, and go for it with this knowledge in mind. Okay, that's it. If you like that, please hit the like button, share it with those of like minds. Subscribe if you haven't already, and over 85% of you have subscribed, which is incredible. Most channels are glad if they can get 10 or 15%. But if you're one of those few people who haven't subscribed, hit the bell. It doesn't cost you any money, and I've learned that it doesn't even electrify you when you touch it. So there's really nothing to lose. And questions and comments, if you've had any experiences that you thought were a little scary, why don't you go ahead and share them? Or if you got any questions about any of this astral wildlife stuff, just go ahead and leave it for me, and I'll do my best to answer it. This is Rick, and I will see you on the astral plane.